The moment the transport ship's bow cut through the gray Atlantic waters, the German POWs pressed themselves against the railings, eyes wide with a mix of fear, confusion, and reluctant curiosity, the salty wind whipping against their jackets and hair as the towering hull seemed to separate them from the world they knew. Behind them, the endless ocean stretched in unbroken steel-colored waves, a reminder that every mile they crossed carried them further from their homeland, from their families, from the war-torn streets of Berlin, Hamburg, and Dresden, and yet ahead of them lay something they had never expected, a strange and almost alien land that shimmered under the autumn sun, its distant shoreline dotted with cranes, warehouses, and the silhouettes of ships far larger than anything they had encountered. And as they stared, the first hints of disbelief spread among them, whispers in guttural German carrying over the wind, questioning, debating, doubting that this could truly be America, a country so vast, so organized, so alive with industry that even the simplest harbor structures seemed monumental. And as the officers barked orders to keep formation, their voices slicing through the murmurs, a surreal hush settled over the deck, because this was not just a journey. It was an initiation into a world they had only glimpsed in propaganda leaflets or overheard rumors. A world they had been taught to hate, fear, and fight against, and now here they were, bound by uniforms, chains, and circumstance, standing at the threshold of it, their eyes absorbing every detail, the massive cranes lifting cargo with almost surgical precision, the perfectly aligned docks bustling with sailors, workers, and officers moving with a rhythm that spoke of efficiency beyond anything they had witnessed in war-ravaged Europe, the buildings along the waterfront shining with fresh paint, wide glass windows reflecting the sunlight in ways that made the POWs squint and instinctively shield their faces, and above all the Americans themselves, a mix of soldiers, guards, and civilians, moving with a strange combination of casual confidence and alert readiness, their faces open yet unreadable, their gestures deliberate but never hurried, as though they had rehearsed this very moment, preparing to meet captured enemies not with hatred or vengeance, but with curiosity, procedure, and a strange, almost disarming civility. And as the ship's gangplank began to lower, the POWs felt an internal shift, the uncertainty pressing like a physical weight in their chests. Their boots clanking on the metal deck as each step forward toward the awaiting docks felt like crossing into an alternate reality, where the war they knew, the chaos, the fear, the constant struggle, was suspended in a space ordered, methodical and terrifyingly calm, a world where the sheer magnitude of organization, the cleanliness of the streets, the pride in each worker's posture, and the invisible discipline of every movement screamed a truth they could not yet process, that America was not just another country to occupy. It was a machine of astonishing efficiency, a society that seemed to operate without the constant panic and scarcity that defined their lives back home. And with every step down the gangplank, the POWs' minds raced, flickering between disbelief, admiration, and an insidious fear, because this was the country that had produced the planes, ships, and weapons that had rained destruction on Europe. And now here it was, unshaken, flourishing, almost smug in its prosperity, a silent indictment of everything they had been taught to believe about the enemy. And as they walked onto the pier, their chains rattling faintly, their uniforms smelling of salt, sweat, and diesel, they noticed children playing near the docks, laughing freely, oblivious to the war that had consumed their continent, women carrying baskets, exchanging greetings with a casual warmth that confused the POWs, sailors unloading cargo humming songs, and officers stopping to inspect crates without a hint of urgency, yet achieving perfect order. And each observation stacked atop the other, an avalanche of sights and sounds, of order and chaos intermingled, a surreal symphony that assaulted their senses, leaving them both disoriented and strangely inspired. Because in every gesture, every line of a dockworker's face, every gleam of polished metal on the ships, they glimpsed a nation that functioned like clockwork, yet lived with humanity, a concept alien to men who had seen the worst of brutality, starvation, and destruction. And even as they were herded toward the temporary POW processing center, the whispers persisted. Ist das wirklich Amerika? Can this be the same country? Is this real? and they noticed the meticulous way the camp was set up. Wooden barracks spaced precisely apart, clean latrines, orderly mess lines, and the American guards treating them not as animals, but as human beings, suspicious, cautious, but fundamentally humane, an approach so unlike the front lines, where death and desperation dominated, that it unsettled them more than any battle ever had. And yet, beneath the awe and disbelief, a quiet tension simmered, for each POW understood, in the pit of their stomachs, that this civility did not negate their captivity, nor the war they had been a part of. It merely reframed it. And as they were marched inside, eyes scanning, hearts racing, they could not shake the image of America's sky and sea stretching endlessly ahead, a silent, omnipresent reminder of the gulf that separated them from everything they knew, and of the lessons that would unfold over the coming months, lessons that would challenge their assumptions, their prejudices, and perhaps even their very understanding of what humanity could look like beyond the battlefield. And as the first sunbeams struck the interior of the processing hall, casting long shadows across polished floors, the POWs realized, collectively and silently, that their world had irrevocably shifted, and that the America they had imagined, whether in nightmares or in propaganda, was something entirely different, something larger, more complex, more orderly, and in ways almost impossible to comprehend. And in that moment, for the first time, the war seemed both far away and impossibly close, and their journey into this alien, meticulous, and astonishingly alive country had only just begun. A journey that would change their perceptions, challenge their beliefs, and ultimately confront them with truths they had never anticipated. As the POWs were led from the docks toward the waiting transport trucks, each step seemed surreal, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing like a metronome, marking time in a world that felt entirely unlike the one they had left behind. And the Americans guiding them maintained a calm, almost theatrical discipline, not a single shout, no frantic gestures, simply measured movements and occasional clipped instructions. And every glance the POWs exchanged carried a question they could not articulate. How could a nation so vast, so unscathed by the chaos of war, operate with such precision, such ease, while their own cities lay in ruins, roofs blown away, streets full of rubble, families starving, and entire industries destroyed? And the contrast was blinding, almost unbearable, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truth that victory in battle had not guaranteed survival or order, that even as German soldiers they had fought with courage, strategy, and skill, yet they now faced a society whose power was built on planning, infrastructure, and a civil order that seemed invincible. And as they were loaded into trucks with seats carefully spaced, seatbelts fastened, and cargo checked for balance, they noticed the quiet efficiency. Tires perfectly inflated, engines purring, drivers exchanging nods, a silent choreography, the kind of coordination that had no counterpart in the battlefields they knew. And as the vehicles began to move toward the temporary camp, the POWs looked out through barred windows at the landscape rushing by. Forests and farmlands, neatly cultivated, rivers flowing unimpeded, smoke only from industrial chimneys. Not burning cities, towns with sidewalks, children waving at the passing vehicles, dogs barking and running alongside, and the air itself seemed different. Cleaner, lighter, carrying scents of pine, earth, and freshly baked bread, aromas that awakened memories long suppressed, childhood visions of home now tangled with the terror of their present captivity. A strange mixture of nostalgia and alienation, and in that strange suspended space, conversation flowed in whispers, each man sharing observations in guttural tones, questioning whether what they saw was real or a dream conjured by fatigue and disorientation, while some remained silent, their faces frozen, eyes reflecting both awe and a subtle, gnawing fear that beneath this civility lay rules and structures they could neither predict nor control. And as the trucks rumbled along, passing rivers crossed by steel bridges, smoke rising from orderly factories, and towns with schoolchildren playing in playgrounds, the POWs' minds raced with images of battles past. Yet juxtaposed against this calm, surreal, almost utopian reality, each scene became a puzzle, a paradox, a test of their perceptions. forcing them to reconcile their conditioning and the propaganda that had taught them that America was decadent, wasteful, morally corrupt, with the undeniable evidence of civility, efficiency, and surprising warmth. And some dared to note the juxtaposition quietly among themselves, guards carrying weapons but never pointing them unnecessarily, checking papers with methodical thoroughness rather than suspicion or cruelty, distributing food without delay or waste, and even small gestures of politeness, such as tipping hats or nodding in acknowledgement, gestures so alien that they unsettled even hardened soldiers accustomed to battlefield atrocities. And as the convoy neared the camp, the POWs began to glimpse the structures of the internment facility, not prison walls looming menacingly, but wooden barracks, cleanly painted, surrounded by wide gravel paths, planted trees and neatly raked grounds. And their initial shock deepened as the Americans directed them toward mess halls where long tables were laid out, not in haphazard disorder, but with plates, cutlery, and trays perfectly aligned. And the scent of fresh bread, cooked vegetables, and roasted meats filled the air, intoxicating to men who had endured months of rationing and starvation. And for the first time, the POWs noticed something entirely unexpected. There was no shouting, no forced marches, no displays of anger or humiliation, only calm supervision, gentle correction, and in some instances, small smiles from the camp personnel, humanizing, disarming, and utterly confusing, because it was not just mercy, it was civility exercised as a principle, and the Germans found themselves trying to reconcile this with all they had been taught about their enemies, a dissonance that gnawed at their pride, their identity, and the very narratives that had justified their participation in the war. And as they were guided toward sleeping quarters, the POWs observed bunks made neatly, mattresses straight, blankets folded, and personal space respected, a stark contrast to the chaos, filth, and fear they had endured in bombed-out towns and combat zones. And in these moments, a quiet, almost imperceptible reflection began to take root. Perhaps their understanding of the enemy, the war, and even the meaning of power itself was flawed. And yet, beneath awe and disorientation, a tension simmered, for they were still captives, their freedom constrained, chains present, and the invisible power of a nation operating above them reminded them of the duality they now occupied: safety and captivity, abundance and restriction, civility and authority. And as the first meal was served, warm and plentiful, they hesitated, unsure how to partake, fingers trembling, eyes darting to observe the behavior of the guards, the orderly sequence of service, and the expressions of other POWs, some of whom embraced the food eagerly, while others barely touched it, consumed by internal conflict between gratitude and suspicion. And in that moment, the full weight of their displacement and the surreal nature of their reception pressed upon them. And as night fell, lanterns illuminating the orderly paths, the POWs were left to their thoughts, staring at the unfamiliar stars of a foreign sky, reflecting on a world so meticulously managed, so detached from the destruction they had known, that it forced them to reconsider the very nature of power, civilization, and humanity itself. And they understood, perhaps for the first time in their lives, that the war they fought had not merely been battles over territory, resources, or ideology, but a collision of contrasting realities: the chaos of destruction versus the order of a society capable of sustaining itself in ways they had never imagined. And with that realization came a quiet, uneasy awe that would haunt their thoughts for weeks to come, a reflection that would ripple through every decision, every observation, and every interaction they experienced in this strange, vast, and astonishingly controlled country called America. And in that darkness, as they lay on their bunks, listening to the distant sounds of waves, the soft clatter of footsteps on gravel, and the faint laughter of American soldiers and civilians in the camp, they knew, with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant respect, that their arrival in this foreign land had irrevocably altered their understanding of the world, and that the journey they had embarked upon was only beginning, a journey that would challenge every assumption, break every expectation, and ultimately leave an imprint on their souls that neither war nor captivity nor time could erase. As dawn broke over the sprawling POW camp, A gentle mist hovered over the neat rows of wooden barracks, the scent of dew mingling with the lingering aroma of the previous night's meals, and the German prisoners, now accustomed to the ordered routines of this foreign land, began to stir, some rubbing sleep from their eyes while others silently observed the unfamiliar rhythms around them. The quiet hum of Americans preparing breakfast, sweeping paths, arranging supplies with meticulous care. And in that subtle orchestration, the POWs sensed a pattern, a discipline so methodical it seemed almost alien, as if every movement were preordained, every interaction carefully measured, yet imbued with an underlying respect for human dignity that contradicted everything they had experienced on battlefields strewn with devastation and bodies. And as they filed toward the mess hall, the clinking of trays and soft murmur of conversation greeted them. A symphony of normalcy so alien that many of the men instinctively stiffened, uncertain how to participate, whether to bow, to salute, or to merely accept the sustenance offered, while others whispered among themselves, remarking on the abundance of food, the cleanliness of utensils, the orderly placement of condiments, and the way Americans moved with calm assurance, no raised voices, no harsh commands, and the POWs were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that civility could coexist with power, that authority did not require intimidation, and that a nation's strength was not merely in its weapons, but in its ability to organize, sustain, and inspire order without resorting to terror. And as the morning progressed, the prisoners were led through the campgrounds, each new observation layering upon the last, children playing near the edges of the camp under the watchful but unobtrusive eyes of guards. Gardens cultivated with precision, workshops where tools were neatly arranged, machinery gleaming under the sunlight, and yet all of it functioning without chaos or coercion. A stark contrast to the disarray, fear, and destruction that had characterized so much of their European experience. And with every passing moment, a quiet, gnawing awe took hold. As the POWs recognized that this ordered, almost serene environment had been built deliberately, thoughtfully, to maintain control while preserving humanity, and the implications were staggering, forcing them to reconsider not only their enemies but the very structure of a society that could marshal such resources, instill such discipline, and yet operate without cruelty. And as they moved toward the infirmary, the prisoners observed another layer of this intricate tapestry. Sick or injured men treated promptly, staff moving with quiet efficiency, kindness lacing every action, medicines dispensed without complaint, beds made meticulously, patients monitored with gentle attentiveness, and the POWs exchanged furtive glances, some unable to mask their astonishment, others shaking their heads in disbelief, and in that moment, the full scope of their captivity's paradox emerged. They were prisoners, yet treated with more respect, care, and dignity than they had ever witnessed in their own military or civilian lives, and as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across gravel paths and manicured lawns, the POWs were led to vocational workshops where they saw Americans repairing vehicles, crafting furniture, sewing uniforms, and processing supplies with an efficiency that bordered on art. Each movement purposeful, each task completed with pride and precision, a stark reminder that labor could be organized not only for survival but for growth, order, and contribution, and the Germans felt an unfamiliar stir of admiration and confusion, for they had been taught to view work as punishment or necessity. Yet here it was imbued with dignity and meaning, and as the day unfolded, the POWs were given small responsibilities, distributing mail, cleaning paths, assisting in kitchens, tasks simple in nature but carried out under guidance that emphasized instruction, not intimidation, correction, not punishment. And the experience forced them to confront another layer of this strange new world. Leadership could exist without fear, authority without cruelty, control without oppression, and that realization struck deeper than any battlefield victory. For it challenged the very ideology they had been raised under, the belief that power required terror, that obedience demanded suffering. That order was inseparable from fear, and as evening approached, the prisoners were led back to their quarters, the soft orange light of sunset filtering through the trees, casting long, calm shadows across the neatly raked gravel. and they paused quietly, absorbing the peace, the rhythm, the subtle harmony of a society functioning efficiently and humanely, a stark contrast to the chaos, destruction, and desperation that had characterized their lives until now. And in that suspended moment, a profound internal shift began to take root, one that would reshape their understanding of civilization, power, and human potential, as they realized that their captors were demonstrating a form of mastery far beyond what weapons or armies could achieve. Mastery over systems, organization, and most astonishingly, over themselves. And with that realization came awe, respect, and an unsettling sense of personal inadequacy, as each prisoner silently reckoned with the truth that the enemy they had feared for years was not only formidable in arms, but extraordinary in the very exercise of civility, order, and human dignity, and that understanding would haunt their reflections for the remainder of their captivity, coloring every interaction, every observation, and every decision they made in this new, meticulously controlled and disarmingly humane world. And as the night descended, lanterns flickering in the stillness, the POWs lay on their bunks, eyes open to the unfamiliar ceiling, contemplating a society that had won not only through military might, but through the cultivation of human order, the preservation of dignity, and the seamless integration of authority with compassion. And as the last whispers of day faded into night, they understood with a clarity that terrified and awed them simultaneously that their war had been fought against a people whose true strength lay not in destruction, but in the meticulous, deliberate, and humane orchestration of civilization itself. And that realization would remain unshakable long after the battles were over. As the morning mist lifted and sunlight spilled across the camp, the German POWs were led toward the sprawling mess hall, an expansive building that smelled of fresh bread, brewed coffee, and simmering stew, a scent so ordinary yet so foreign that it seemed almost unreal to men who had lived months of rationed, meager meals and constant hunger. The doors opened, and they stepped inside cautiously, trays in hand, expecting barked orders or disdainful looks, but instead found Americans moving calmly among long tables, smiling faintly, assisting wherever needed, placing plates with quiet efficiency. And the prisoners froze, unsure how to react to this courtesy, a simple act that carried the weight of entire philosophies. For they had been raised to believe that civility was a luxury for allies, never for enemies. And yet here it was, extended without hesitation, offered without precondition, and the effect was disorienting, stirring a complex mix of disbelief, gratitude, and unease, as if the very air had been rewritten to challenge their assumptions. As they settled into long benches, trays laden with abundant portions of meat, vegetables, and bread, they noticed the careful arrangement of utensils, the attention to cleanliness, and the methodical pace of serving, each action deliberate, precise, and yet imbued with patience, a stark contrast to the chaos and desperation of their own barracks in Europe. And as they began to eat, the conversation around them was muted, polite, tinged with humor and lightness that felt almost forbidden, the sounds of laughter and low chatter a balm to ears accustomed to shouts and screams. And as each bite was taken, the POW's astonishment deepened, realizing that nourishment here was plentiful and freely offered, not rationed or hoarded, not a prize to be fought over, but a fundamental expectation of human decency, a lesson in the very values their captors embodied without ostentation. The day unfolded further as they were guided through the camp's workshops where tools gleamed, machines hummed, and every worker moved with purpose and care, crafting, repairing, and organizing in a rhythm that was mesmerizing. The POWs observing the precision and order with awe, noting how raw materials became functional items through coordinated effort, how every movement was intentional, every action contributing to a system greater than any individual. And the realization struck that here, discipline was exercised not through fear, but through pride, efficiency, and mutual respect. And the POWs' eyes widened as they saw the children of American families playing nearby, under watchful eyes yet with complete freedom, running across lawns, laughing, learning, living, while the adults supervised with quiet attentiveness, never raising voices unnecessarily, never instilling terror. And the prisoners whispered among themselves, comparing these scenes to the regimentation and oppression of their own upbringing, where obedience was enforced through punishment and fear, and where joy was often a fleeting shadow. As the hours passed, the POWs were introduced to vocational training sessions, assigned small tasks that built competence and responsibility, each task supervised patiently, corrections made gently, and the men realized that labor here was not drudgery but a structured opportunity to contribute, to learn and to regain a sense of purpose, a profound departure from the coercion and brutality that had defined their past. And this slow accumulation of observation, participation, and reflection pressed upon their minds like a wave of revelation that the enemy they had fought, the Americans, had constructed a society where order, efficiency, and human dignity were inseparable, where authority could coexist with compassion, and where the collective good was pursued without dehumanizing the individual. By mid-afternoon, as they were escorted past gardens cultivated with meticulous care, greenhouses brimming with vegetables, and neatly organized supply depots, the POW's astonishment deepened further, the layers of civilization unfolding before them like a carefully orchestrated symphony, each element reinforcing the impression that this was a land whose strength was derived not merely from military might, but from the seamless integration of discipline, structure, and empathy. And as they paused to rest beneath towering trees, shaded paths, and well-maintained grounds, the prisoners realized that they were witnessing a society where the machinery of order had been humanized, where even the act of survival did not require cruelty, and where every person, regardless of status, could participate in maintaining a functioning, thriving community. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows over the camp, they were led back to their barracks, hearts heavy with wonder and confusion, minds racing with comparisons to their homeland. And in the quiet moments before lights out, lying on bunks that were clean, comfortable, and organized, they contemplated the paradox. They were captives in a foreign land, yet treated with more dignity, care, and respect than they had ever known in their own military units. A realization that unsettled and awed them in equal measure, planting seeds of introspection about the nature of power, leadership, and humanity itself. And as darkness enveloped the camp, the POWs stared at the ceiling, silent, minds churning with understanding that the enemy they had feared for years was formidable not just in arms, but in the deliberate, humane, and precise orchestration of an entire society, a revelation that would shape their memories long after the war ended, forever altering their perception of what it meant to be strong, civilized, and human. The following morning dawned with a crisp clarity that made the camp feel almost surreal, as if sunlight itself were trying to illuminate the improbable reality before the German POWs. And when they were led to the sprawling recreational grounds, their eyes widened in disbelief. Rows of fields, meticulously maintained, stretched as far as the eye could see, marked for sports, exercise, and communal activities, with American soldiers and civilians moving about with a calm purpose, organizing games, teaching children to throw balls, run relays, and practice drills, laughter mingling with the crisp morning air, an orchestration of discipline and joy that was alien to men whose childhoods had been dominated by rigid obedience, scarcity, and the constant presence of authority. The POWs watched, hesitant at first, unsure how to participate, yet drawn by the sheer humanity of the scene, noticing how each action, though seemingly ordinary, carried with it an implicit lesson about cooperation, patience, and mutual respect, how adults guided without intimidation, how mistakes were corrected without derision, and how even small successes were met with genuine encouragement. A stark contrast to the harsh punishments and ridicule they had known. And as they tentatively joined in, tossing balls or running short sprints, they felt the initial awkwardness give way to a strange exhilaration, a sensation they hadn't felt in months, perhaps years of confinement and warfare. Beyond the fields, workshops hummed with quiet industry, POWs observing Americans repairing vehicles, sharpening tools, and coordinating supply chains with precision that bordered on artistry. The movements methodical, efficient, yet infused with an unmistakable human touch. And the prisoners could not help but compare it to their own experiences in Europe, where labor had been enforced, brutal and often meaningless, and here they saw purpose combined with dignity. The act of work transformed into a system of engagement, learning and contribution, where each individual's effort had visible impact, where mistakes were tolerated as part of a process, and where the sense of accomplishment was nurtured rather than crushed. Lunch brought further astonishment as the POWs were served in open-air pavilions with long tables, plates abundant with food, water, and juice flowing freely, and every item neatly arranged. Sanitation observed meticulously, and yet, the most remarkable aspect was the absence of fear or tension, the lack of suspicion, the sense that even captives were trusted to care for themselves responsibly, a concept entirely foreign to those accustomed to life in strict barracks under constant supervision, where every action was monitored, every step dictated. As the afternoon unfolded, the men were shown libraries filled with books in multiple languages, writing materials, and even musical instruments. Spaces designed not just for passing time, but for growth, creativity, and personal development. And the POWs marveled at the thought that their captors had constructed an environment where education, culture, and mental well-being were prioritized alongside physical survival, a realization that made them reconsider everything they had assumed about humanity, civility, and the purpose of authority. Guided through art classes, small theater productions, and lectures on practical skills, the POWs experienced moments of pure astonishment, watching Americans patiently teach, correct, and inspire, nurturing competence and confidence instead of obedience born from fear. And they began to notice subtle patterns: the organization of schedules, the care in provisioning, the structured yet flexible system that allowed both order and freedom, all designed to create a functional, thriving community even under the stresses of war, and to instill in each individual a sense of personal responsibility and empowerment, an approach so profoundly different from what they had known that it challenged their very core beliefs about leadership, morality, and human nature. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, the POWs were led back to their quarters, silent, reflective, their minds racing with impressions of what they had seen and participated in, hearts heavy with a mixture of humility, awe, and disbelief, realizing that their understanding of enemy had been expanded to include not only military might, but also the nuanced, deliberate cultivation of community, empathy, and efficiency. And lying on their bunks that night, they could not sleep easily, haunted not by fear or regret, but by the overwhelming recognition that the American strength lay as much in the careful orchestration of their society and humane treatment of prisoners as it did in their guns, ships, and planes, an insight that would echo through the rest of their lives, reshaping their perceptions of power, civility, and the possibility of reconciliation amidst the ruins of war. The morning mist clung to the edges of the American POW camp like a curtain of uncertainty, and as the German prisoners were led out to the docks, their eyes widened at the most surreal spectacle they had yet encountered. Massive cargo ships gleaming under the soft sun were being loaded and unloaded with precision that seemed almost choreographed. Crates of supplies, barrels of food, medical equipment, and ammunition moving effortlessly as if by some invisible hand. Sailors and dock workers communicating with terse gestures and sharp calls. Yet beneath the rigid efficiency, there was a rhythm, a harmony, a coordination that seemed designed to inspire confidence rather than fear. And the POWs, accustomed to the chaos, shortages, and improvisation of wartime Germany, could not fathom such order, such abundance, such apparent care in logistics, and as they watched, a sense of disbelief mingled with admiration and a quiet dread, for they realized that the enemy they had fought with fury was sustained not merely by weapons and numbers, but by a meticulous, relentless system of organization, foresight, and human ingenuity. Later, as they toured the medical tents, they observed doctors and nurses moving among the wounded and sick with calm efficiency, offering care, explanation, and comfort in equal measure, treating not only American soldiers but also captured Germans with a consistency and dignity that defied everything they had expected from their captors. And in that moment, they felt an unfamiliar mixture of shame, gratitude, and incredulity, seeing men who had once been the enemy treated with humanity and respect, realizing that the values of compassion and professionalism were wielded as surely as rifles and artillery in the machinery of war. When the POWs were taken to the mess halls for a communal meal, the scene was almost theatrical in its normalcy. Tables laden with fresh bread, meat, vegetables, and desserts, organized lines, orderly service, laughter and conversation flowing freely, and prisoners were invited to participate without guards hovering, to choose their portions responsibly, to interact with Americans as equals in the simplest, most profound sense of the word, a stark contrast to the rigid, fear-laden hierarchy they had endured, and the sheer ordinariness of it was astonishing, the ordinary acts of nourishment and camaraderie becoming an almost surreal revelation, an unspoken demonstration of strength through civility, organization, and trust. The afternoon brought lessons in agriculture, carpentry, and machinery, with POWs encouraged to learn, to touch, to create, and to contribute, the Americans guiding with patience and respect, correcting mistakes gently, celebrating successes enthusiastically, and as the German soldiers worked, a transformation began, subtle but undeniable, a shift from suspicion to engagement, from fear to curiosity, from alienation to participation, each man confronting the unexpected reality that his captors could teach, empower and uplift rather than merely restrain and punish, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. The POWs gathered for evening roll call, and the camp commander addressed them not with threats, but with words of instruction, encouragement, and warning couched in respect and clarity, emphasizing responsibility, cooperation, and self-reliance, leaving them with a sense of agency and dignity, a sensation wholly unfamiliar yet strangely comforting, as though the very structure of authority had been transformed into something that nurtured rather than oppressed. And they realized, in the quiet moments of reflection that followed, that the true power of their captors lay not only in military might, but in the careful cultivation of human potential, trust, and order. That night, as they lay in their bunks, listening to the distant hum of generators and the soft murmur of fellow prisoners speaking in low tones, they could not sleep easily, their minds replaying the astonishing events of the day, the ships, the workshops, the mess halls, the lessons, the conversations, each a revelation that defied their understanding of enemy, authority, and civilization. And as darkness settled over the camp, they realized that they had been witness to something extraordinary, something that would haunt them long after the war, a vision of a world in which discipline, efficiency, and humanity coexisted, a stark contrast to the destruction, fear, and brutality that had defined their previous experiences. And they understood, with a mixture of awe and unease, that the Americans' true victory was not only in weapons and strategy, but in the creation of a society that could sustain, teach, and transform even those it captured, a lesson that no battlefield could convey, a victory of method, morality, and vision that would echo across decades.